An incident that looked like an eerie scene from a horror movie happened in Florida in 2021. Not only was it surprising, but it was quite disturbing too. A man and his grandson were having their version of family time when suddenly a fight ensued that ended in the old man lying in a pool of his own blood with his 2 ears sliced off. What could have caused the fight? And why did the killer have to cut off the old man's ears in what could be guessed a fetish act? Colby Parker and his grandfather, Ronald Wells, lived in the quiet community of County Lake, Florida. Colby was a 30-year-old man who did all sorts of jobs to make ends meet. His original dream was unclear, but somehow he fell among the wrong crowd and started dealing with different types of narcotics, including marijuana, which he often smoked with his grandfather. Ronald Wells, on the other hand, was a 77-year-old retiree, enjoying the twilight years of his life. He had spent most of his days as a hard-working blue-collar worker, raising his family and building a peaceful life in County Lake. In his senior years, Ronald had grown fond of fishing by the lakeside, where he often shared reminiscences of his youth and the simpler times he cherished. Despite the age gap, Colby and Ronald shared a unique bond. They would often sit by the lake, passing a joint between them, while Colby would sit beside him and create a bridge between generations. Ronald, in his wisdom, would share stories of his past, imparting life lessons to his grandson. However, as time went on, Colby's life took a different turn. The allure of drugs began to consume him. The tranquil lakeside moments with his grandfather became increasingly erratic. Soon, they began having incessant fights over little and big reasons, and with each fight, the distance between them widened. It was within this period of a strained familial relationship and the shared habit of smoking marijuana that the events leading to the tragic incident happened. On March 13, 2021, the day began like any other Saturday in County Lake, Florida. But just in a matter of hours, it was marked by a tragedy that shook the entire community. That day, Colby Parker and his grandfather, Ronald Wells, found themselves entangled in an argument that had been simmering beneath the surface for weeks. The argument was ignited by a combination of factors. Colby's drug use had escalated, causing him to become increasingly erratic and unpredictable. The problem was hinted to have been due to the money he borrowed from the old man, with multiple promises to pay back that ended up in failure. On that dreadful Saturday morning, Colby approached Ronald once more, asking for money to support his drug habit. Ronald, who had now become exhausted by the constant financial strain and his grandson's deteriorating behaviour, firmly refused. The tension between them reached a breaking point and harsh words were exchanged. As the argument escalated, it quickly spiraled out of control. Fueled by anger, desperation, and the influence of drugs, Colby snapped. In a moment of blind rage, he lashed out at his grandfather, and before anyone could intervene, Ronald lay in a pool of his blood on the porch of their home. The shocking scene sent shockwaves through the quiet community of County Lake. Neighbours peered fearfully from their windows, too scared to confront the maniac who stood over the lifeless body of his grandfather. The once peaceful neighbourhood was now a scene of horror, and the tragic events of that Saturday would haunt the community for years to come. The Lake County Police Department received a frantic call from Ronald Wells Jr., who reported that his grandfather had attacked him with a knife but had managed to disarm him. Responding swiftly, the police arrived at the scene, only to be met with a gruesome and perplexing sight. On the porch of the Wells residence lay the lifeless, blood-soaked body of Ronald Wells Sr., the elderly victim of this horrifying incident. What was even more disturbing was the absence of Ronald Wells Jr. at the scene. Instead, they found Colby Parker looking battered and bruised, an appearance that showed he had been in a violent brawl. The police immediately started to question him about the events that had transpired in a bid to get the full picture of what had truly happened. In his initial statement, Colby claimed that his grandfather had attacked him for no apparent reason, and he had managed to overpower and subdue him due to his physical strength. But the multiple stab wounds on Ronald's body and the gruesome detail that both of his ears were missing cast a huge shadow of doubt over Colby's account. His story just wasn't adding up. The puzzling and gruesome nature of the crime raised many questions for the police. For one, Ronald Wells Jr., who made the call, was not on the scene. Was Colby the same person who made the call and was only messing with the police? They needed to find out the truth, no matter how daunting the task turned out to be. While he was being quizzed, the police noticed a slight bulge in his pocket, and when they asked him about it, he dipped his hands in his pockets, and what he brought out was shocking to the officers present. Alas, it was a pair of his grandfather's ears. From all indications, this was not an act of self-defense. To beat someone to a pulp and then cut off their ears seemed premeditated. With this, the police, having restrained Colby, dashed inside, and what they met was equally bone-chilling. In a corner of the living room, they found a blood-covered baseball bat, which immediately became a critical piece of evidence. On careful examination, it was evident that the blood and material on the bat belonged to no other person than Ronald Wells. Its presence raised questions about the nature of the altercation and whether it was the primary weapon used. With further search, they discovered a butcher knife that had blood on it on the kitchen table. This too indicated that there might have been multiple weapons involved in the confrontation. Right on the floor, there was a pool of blood that had formed and had started to congeal. The pool of blood on the kitchen floor suggested a violent struggle had taken place inside the house. It was perhaps where Colby had stabbed the old man before deciding to cut off his ears as an afterthought. Inside Colby's room, an even greater shock awaited them the whole time. There was an apron that had a gory translation to its inscription. On the apron was written, "The Family's Butcher." This sent shivers down the investigators' spines, as nobody had volunteered if the family was at some point in the abattoir's business. At this juncture, the police couldn't help but link the disturbing detail discovered to a potential motive or psychological state of the suspect. Needless to say, the apron had blood on it, and more than that, there were 2 pairs of plastic ears sewn to it. As the forensic analysis progressed, the police were left with a perplexing set of evidence that raised questions about the nature of the crime, the involvement of multiple weapons, and the possibility of a deeply disturbed mind behind the brutal murder. And the truth behind the tragic events in County Lake would soon come to light. Still at the front porch, the police continued with their questioning, but at this point they noticed a sudden shift in Colby Parker's demeanour. His eyes darted nervously, and beads of sweat started to form on his forehead. The police knew for a fact that something wasn't right with him, and so decided to keep an eye on him. After a while, Colby started asking police about their guns, but to what purpose? They were still gathering evidence and trying to get him to the waiting police car when his desperation reached a breaking point. In a sudden and desperate move, he lunged for one of the detectives' holstered firearms. The detectives too reacted swiftly and attempted to subdue Colby. They reached for their tasers to incapacitate him, but Colby's adrenaline-fueled resistance proved formidable. The tasers did not affect him. In a short time, the front porch became a chaotic battleground as they wrestled with Colby, who was hell-bent on obtaining the firearm. With sheer determination and teamwork, the detectives managed to overpower Colby by disarming and restraining him. Finally, they apprehended Colby Parker, but this harrowing confrontation had brought them closer to the chilling truth lurking behind the family's butcher apron and the grisly discoveries inside the Wells residence. In a moment of raw honesty, Colby Parker, haunted by the weight of his actions, decided to reveal the ghastly truth. He admitted to wielding the baseball bat and striking his grandfather multiple times until the old man lay lifeless before him. Also, he confessed to severing his grandfather's ears from his lifeless body. When questioned about the motive behind such a horrifying act, Colby's response sent shivers down the spines of those present. He claimed that he believed by sending his grandfather to meet his late grandmother in the afterlife, he was somehow doing a service to his family. It was as if Colby's mind had become a dark maze of delusions, where the boundaries of reality blurred into a spooky hallucination. Yet, amidst this tale of terror and despair, a sobering realization emerged. It seemed Colby's actions could only be linked to a turbulent mixture of drug-induced fog and mental anguish. The lines between right and wrong had become hazy, and the once promising life of a troubled young man had taken a horrifying turn into the depths of darkness. Amid the chaotic scuffle, Colby had suffered injuries that necessitated a trip to the hospital before facing the impending court hearing. His battered body, a result of the violent confrontation with the police, required medical attention. Once stabilized, Colby faced a daunting legal reckoning. He found himself charged with a trifecta of serious offences that included second-degree murder, domestic violence, and assault of a police officer. In the eyes of the law, Colby was deemed a substantial flight risk and a potential danger to society. Consequently, he was denied bail and held in custody, awaiting his day in court, where he would have to confront the grave consequences of his actions. One could say Ronald Wells, the deceased, was also guilty of smoking marijuana with his grandson, whom he ought to have reported to the authorities when he started showing signs of mental inconsistencies. Who knows, he could have avoided the gruesome death and lived out the rest of his days peacefully.